Hi, in this video, we're going to look at crop protection management. We've earlier looked at crop production management. This video will deal with how we protect our crops. When we talk about protecting our crops, we can classify it or we can break it up in two ways. One is we can break it up based on the type of threat into threats caused by abiotic factors and those caused by biotic factors. Or we can look at the phase of action, which is to say at what phase we are able to take action on this. For example, pre-harvest, before we harvest, or post-harvest, after we harvest. Let's look at a list of these threats. So we have abiotic threats like intense heat or intense cold. We have extremely dry conditions or waterlogged conditions when the soil gets completely filled with water, or we have extreme weather events like hail that we are familiar with in Himachal Pradesh. When we talk of biotic factors, there are pests, there are weeds, and there are diseases. All of these will be dealt with in detail. So how do we go about managing these? Broadly, we can use anti-hail nets. You must have seen these around Himachal quite commonly. Polyhouses, something called polytunnels, which will be dealt with later in this video. A technique called mulching, and of course, spraying our crops with certain substances. So let's move forward. Let's look at abiotic threats. These are the threats that are not caused by living things. They are caused by things other than living things. Here's a photograph of anti-hail nets. Himachal, you will see these anti-hail nets go up in the month of March or April. And then they stay around till August when the monsoons arrive, because once the monsoons arrive, we find that the chance of hail is very low. Another way to protect our crops against hail is people use something called an anti-hail cannon. But that is not a proven technology, so we won't discuss it here. Now, the great thing about the anti-hail nets is that they are able to disperse sunlight. So when the sunlight gets very intense, these anti-hail nets actually they disperse sunlight and prevent something called sunburn in apples. So that is again another form of protection against abiotic damage by abiotic factors. Here's a polyhouse. You must have seen these. These protect crops against low temperatures. So in winter, often crops get destroyed by frosting. Polyhouses, their temperature on average is 4 to 5 degrees above their surrounding temperatures, and to quite an extent are able to protect against low temperatures. They also protect the soil from humidity loss and drought. It is easier to provide water inside a polyhouse because whatever water evaporates at night, it tends to condense and drip down back into the polyhouse. So this protects plants against drought. And of course, there is protection from insects and pests. These are biotic factors. We will be considering them in a later section, but nonetheless, polyhouses are able to protect them against that. Here's a photograph of polytunnels. This is a technique that is now gaining traction in India. And so these are small, they function just in the same way as polyhouses, but they are small and like tunnels as shown in the photograph. Now, mulching is basically covering the soil around the crop with something. Now, there are many ways of mulching. One is you can cut the weeds around the plant and lay them on the ground near the crop. You can actually buy bales of straw from rice or wheat cultivation, which is a waste. It's an agricultural waste, and you can lay that between the crop, as shown in the first photograph. Or as shown in the second photograph, that black thing there is actually plastic, and this is called plastic mulching. Now, what does mulching do? To begin with, it reduces evaporation. It prevents the soil from getting too hot or too cold. It controls erosion. So if you have in the hills, like when you have large amounts of erosion, what typically one does is you cover the entire area with this plastic mulch. So it allows excess water to flow away, but when there is light rain, it allows the water to come to percolate through. So it prevents erosion, it prevents the flow of water. And finally, it controls weeds. Again, weeds is a biotic threat to our crops, but we're discussing it here because we're discussing mulching. Now let's look at biotic threats. So these are the threats posed to crops by living things. We can broadly look at them in the following categories. So we have butterflies and moths, we have locusts, which are like which are like grasshoppers. Then we have beetles and we have flies. So the codling moth, in this picture, you can see the picture on the left-hand side. You will often find these caterpillars bunched at the tops of apple trees where they weave their silk. And these are actually the larvae of the codling moth. So after they eat the leaves at the tip of the branch, they pupate, they form pupae, and after that they come out as these moths and then go ahead to other trees and lay their eggs. So codling moths can actually they can cause damage to significant damage to the apple crop and need to be controlled. Next, you have weevils. So in Hindi, these are called sundi, and from the picture, it's amply evident why they're called sundi, because they have these long snouts. Most commonly, you will find them in your rice bin. If you have kept your rice undisturbed for a very long period of time, or even if you're using it but keep it for a very long period of time, you will find these weevils. Weevils are a type of beetle, and of course, beetles cause a large amount of damage to crops. Here we see the stem borer. It's another beetle larva, and there are many kinds of stem borers which affect everything from rajma to apple trees. Commonly, you will see them. So these are the larvae of beetles. And finally, you have flies of various sorts. Most commonly in Himachal, we have a problem with fruit fly larvae. They say that when it rains, that cherries, in fact, get worms inside them. Those are not worms. Those are the larvae of fruit flies. So after it rains, the fruit flies lay their eggs on cherries and their larvae go inside cherries. And that's a very horrible thing for the person eating the cherry, because when you bite into it, you find a small white larva sticking out. So this is a definite problem for cherry cultivation. Locusts, as you can see in the picture, are a kind of cricket, and what happens is sometimes you have large swarms of these locusts which fly through an area and they destroy everything in their path, because they indiscriminately eat most vegetative material there. So these cause significant problems to agricultural crops. And last of all, here is an example of bollworm, which is something which is a major destroyer of cotton crops. Cotton, of course, is not grown in Himachal, but this is a pest which causes significant damage, so it's been included here. So how do we deal with these insect pests? Well, one way is insecticides. Now, insecticides we can classify into approximately 3 types. The third type is not really an insecticide, but the first is what we call systemic insecticides. So these are insecticides which kill the insect after the insect has eaten this insecticide. So many insects that suck the sap of plants are targeted by this method, because if we can introduce these insecticides into the plant or into the leaf surface, then these insects suck on that, on the sap, and they then die. The other possibility is the use of contact insecticides, which simply kill the insect when they come into contact. Those of you who have used the Lakshman Rekha at home, which is a chalk line we draw, and when the insect walks across it, it dies. That's alethrin. That's a contact insecticide. So many sprays, we spray the insect with an insecticide. Many insecticides come in spray cans. Most of these are contact insecticides. As they touch the insect, they kill the insect. We won't go into how they work. You can read up on that. Finally, we have fumigants. These are not insecticides because they don't really kill the insect, but what they do is they drive away insects by their very smell. And this you will have seen people using things like, for example, naphthalene balls or even camphor. These are household items. These are household fumigants. But agriculturally, we have several fumigants which create a smell that drives away insects, and those are called fumigants. We don't have to use insecticides. We can use certain other methods. Here we can see two methods that are being used. One is called a pheromone trap. Pheromones are chemical substances that insects produce to attract other insects during their mating season. So humans, of course, have used their ingenuity. So we place an synthetic, an artificial pheromone inside this trap. And as you can see, the trap that is shown, there is a funnel leading into a plastic bag. So the insects smell the pheromone and are attracted. They are finding a mate. But instead of that, they find this funnel and they enter that plastic bag. And once they enter this plastic bag, because the funnel has a narrow mouth, they have a hard time coming back out. And they get trapped in this bag. And then, of course, the farmer is free to do whatever he or she wants to do with the insects in that bag. The next method is one that has been used traditionally in Himachal Pradesh quite effectively for the planting of annual crops, which is intercropping. So you plant a line of one crop and then intersperse it with another crop. In the photograph here, you can see the yellow flowers, which are called genda in Hindi and marigold in English. And they produce a substance which is in fact a repellent. It repels insects. Instead of genda, people use garlic quite effectively. And also when they grow cannabis for bhangjiri, I don't know if you know about the seeds for bhangjiri. So that is also a powerful insect repellent, which was traditionally used, not so common anymore, but it was traditionally used at least in the early 2000s, I have seen it. So that's intercropping. So this is another way of managing pests without actually having to do too much. Other pests. So apart from insects, we have many other kinds of pests. Let's briefly look into these so that you have an idea that these threats do exist. Those who have seen apple orchards would have seen these nodes at trees, these nodes which seem to get little bumps and sometimes root-like structures coming out. These are called galls, and this particular disease is called crown gall in apple. It's caused by a bacterium, and one of the big problems about having this is that if you try to cut this gall out with a pruning shear or a pruning scissor, the bacterium is transferred onto that scissor, and any tree that you cut freshly after that, this disease can be transferred from one tree to another. So it's very difficult to control this. This is caused by a bacterium called agrobacterium. Our soil is full of billions and billions of worms called nematode worms, and these cause numerous problems in all kinds of crops, but most of those problems are caused in the root system because these nematodes, they burrow through the roots and they eat some part of the roots and cause damage. So here you can see in tomatoes, you have the root knot disease. This is caused by nematode worms, and they are quite tricky to deal with because to target them is not such a simple thing because they're there throughout the soil. Then we have viral diseases of various sorts. So here you see the tomato mosaic disease. It causes this pattern which is also called a mosaic, like tiles. And so this is tomato mosaic. It's caused by a virus. And in Himachal, you will see that peaches are particularly susceptible to a leaf curl disease where the leaf curls. and that is also a viral disease. Let's look at fungi as a cause of disease in crops. In apples in Himachal, fungi are a major cause of problems. This is because our apple harvest takes place during the monsoons, and the monsoons is a period when there's a lot of humidity, and therefore there are a lot of fungi. Let's look at some examples. We'll begin with rust, which is a kind of fungus that affects gramineous plants like rice and wheat. You'll find the rice and wheat leaves get these little rust-colored dots on them, and this is caused by a group of fungi called rusts. Then in the second picture, second set of pictures, you see apple stems sometimes get this scaly covering and then they split open. This is another fungus which causes canker. The bane of apple cultivation in Himachal are a pair of fungi, one called Masonina and the other called Alternaria. You'll find that early in the summer, the leaves begin getting these spots on them. And as it gets more humid, those spots become more intense. And with the first rains, these leaves become yellow and they fall, and the apple trees are left with apples the size of walnuts, which are then, of course, no use to sell. So one is Masonina, the other is Alternaria. Both of these are fungi that affect apple crops. In the lower picture, you can see powdery mildew. The tips of apple plants get this white covering called powdery mildew, and this affects the growth of the plant, the growing tips of the plant, and affects the crop for subsequent years. So how do we manage fungi? One very simple way is to avoid monoculture. We've spoken about monoculture in the previous video. And by intercropping and mixed cropping. So you can see in the image, if you can actually have zones of different crops, that prevents the spread of spores, fungal spores, to some extent and reduces the impact of fungal disease on crops. More commonly, we use fungicide sprays in apple cultivation during the monsoons. Every 15 days, people use fungicide sprays. If you have a deadly soil fungus, we can use soil fumigation, where we actually dig the ground where an old tree was and we fumigate the entire thing. You might also have seen, as shown in the picture, the barks, the trunks of many trees are painted with antifungal paints. They might contain substances like copper oxychloride or lead oxide in linseed oil, and we paint these on the trunks to prevent infection by fungi. Now let's come to weeds. So the main problem with weeds are basically plants which we don't want, which grow alongside our crops and compete with the crop for nutrients, sunlight, and water. They often bear pests or diseases that they then transmit to the crops. In Pujarli, we have aphids which come with cumber or bidens, and then what happens is from the cumber they spread to our agricultural crops and reduce yield and productivity. They may also interfere with the harvest of the crop. When you are harvesting your crop, you will often find weeds in between, making it harder to actually get only your crop. You get a mixture of your crop and your weeds. It increases the amount of time. And in the case of argemony, which is shown in this picture, if the seeds of argemony happen to be harvested along with the seeds of mustard, the mustard oil made from that is actually contaminated and can actually be dangerous for health. So how can we control weeds? The simplest and most common method used on a smaller scale is manual weeding, where we go and by hand we pick out these weeds. You can use herbicides. The issue with herbicides is that it doesn't selectively kill weeds, it kills all plants that it comes into contact with. And finally, you have mulching, which we have seen before, where we cover the area around the crop with either some straw, or the weeds themselves can be uprooted and laid over there, or we can use plastic for mulching. Once these are laid and they form a layer on top of the soil, the chance of new plants sprouting from there is relatively low. Here is an image of glyphosate. Glyphosate is a commonly used herbicide, and you can see a plant before and after the application of glyphosate. As I said before, herbicides don't selectively kill plants, they kill all plants that they come into contact with, and therefore cannot be used indiscriminately. We have to use them at specific phases where we don't mind killing all plants that are present there. Now, when we talk about pesticides or fungicides or herbicides, they are not all entirely safe and they don't come without problems as such. So we have to develop some understanding of this. If we look at pesticides as an example, the first thing is they cause groundwater pollution. Whatever pesticides or herbicides or fungicides we use, they have the capacity, if they are dissolved in water, they have the capacity of seeping through the soil and contaminating our groundwater. This is a big problem, especially in the hills, because a lot in villages, a lot of home water used at home comes from springs, which may actually be contaminated by these substances. The next is ecological destabilization. When you use an insecticide to kill an insect, you end up killing many other insects along with that. Now, how can this be problematic? Let's look at the case of aphids. We have aphids which suck on the sap of plants, and we have ladybirds which eat these aphids. Now, when we spray an insecticide, if we end up killing the ladybirds along with the aphids, then we have effectively killed the one biological control agent for the aphids, which is to say that when the aphids come back, we don't have any natural controls against those aphids, and we will have a tougher time controlling them the second time around. This happens in the case of fungi and many other pests. Then there are human health issues. Most of these substances have toxicity. They are toxic to us in some way or the other. Of course, they all come with directions. For example, most fungicides have a direction that they should not be sprayed less than 15 days before harvest. Many of them come with these insecticides. But despite these warnings, they do come with certain health hazards. They tend to collect in our livers. They may cause cancer. They may cause birth deformities, which are reasonably common. And the fact is that before we can fully understand the ill effects of these substances, sometimes we have already used them for 10 to 15 years. Like in the case of glyphosate as a weedicide, we are only now discovering, or it is only now being revealed to the public, that it is actually a reasonably powerful carcinogen, which is that it is capable of causing cancer. So these things do come with human health issues. And then, of course, we have the problem of biomagnification, which is that when you spray an insecticide, for example, and an insect dies, if another insect, or let's say perhaps a lizard, eats those dead insects, that pesticide often collects in the organs of the lizard. Now, if the lizard were to be eaten by, let's say, a hen or a chicken or something like that, and you were to eat that chicken, if the chicken has eaten 5 lizards and those 5 lizards have eaten 200 insects, so you find that the pesticide or the insecticide is gradually accumulating as you go up the food chain, and this poses a severe threat to all organisms higher up in the food chain. So should we abandon the use of chemical pesticides and weedicides altogether? The fact is we cannot. In the absence of these insecticides and pesticides, our crop yields will go down so low that most places, most farmers will find that it is not economically viable, and most countries will find that they cannot support their population on the amount of uh, food that they produce. Some amount of these substances have to be used, but that does not mean that we should use them indiscriminately. We can minimize their use to minimize their ill effects. How is this to be done? So, one common practice is to destroy infected plant material. Yeah, if you have plant material which is infected, is to dispose of that material properly in fire, okay, or by dipping it in some substance which will actually render the agent of disease neutral. You have preventive spray schedules, which is to say you can spray something to prevent a disease or to prevent an invasion rather than waiting for it to happen. Is to use preventive spray schedules actually saves on the quantity of insecticide and fungicide that one might have to use. One challenge facing India is regional consistency. In countries where farming is mechanized, the spraying of pesticides and herbicides and other such chemicals is done by aeroplane in large areas, so that actually eliminates the disease in large areas. In India, we have the problem of small farm size, and because of this, I might be spraying a fungicide, but my neighbor might not. As a result of which, my own spray of fungicide is less effective than it would be if we all followed the same practice at the same time. The next is early intervention, is to not allow the disease to develop, which means to track it as it is developing and eliminate it as it is developing. And finally, we have processes like soil fumigation, which is to say that when you, for example, uproot a tree before planting a new one, if you were to fumigate the soil, it prevents passing of the disease from one generation to the next and will save you on quite a bit of pesticide use, for example, in the future. So these are just some ideas. There are, of course, many more, but these are just some basic ideas that we can use. So far, we have only discussed how to prevent, how to protect our crops before harvest. But once we harvest our crops, we continue to have the issue of having to protect that which we have harvested. One very common way of doing this is to dry substances. Whenever we dry something, we remove all the water there is in it, we dehydrate it, and by doing so, we make it unfavorable for either insects to eat it or for any fungi or bacteria to grow in it. Additionally, if we sun dry it, the presence of ultraviolet light kills microbes. Then is the process of screening. Modern technology has allowed us, for example, in apple grading machines, which are slightly advanced, they detect the presence of, for example, insects which are inside the apples, and those apples are discarded. And by catching this early, we prevent their spread and the damage of the crop after it has been harvested. When we cold store something, we prevent the growth of bacteria and fungi. We also have vacuum packing of food materials. When we vacuum pack something, we remove all the air and we make it extremely hard for anything to survive in those conditions. And finally, there are certain organic pesticides, which does not necessarily mean they're safe. Organic doesn't always mean they're safe. But neem oil, for example, is a pesticide that can be added to rice to prevent the growth of weevils. However, of course, before cooking that rice, we have to be sure to get rid of all the neem oil. So these are some ways of actually protecting our crops after harvesting. And with that, we come to the end of this presentation.